The hollow moon didn't hum. It breathed. From the observation deck of the SCV Numenera, Dr. Elian Sereth stood alone in a cocoon of reinforced glass and ionized silence, watching the impossible structure drift across the star's cape like a godless eye. His jaw was locked, fists clenched at his sides, nails pressing into his palms as if pain might anchor him. Smooth, lightless, craterless, a sphere that should have never formed naturally. It moved without momentum, without origin, as if some ancient law of the universe had simply forgiven it for existing. In a cocoon of reinforced glass and ionized silence, watching the impossible structure drift across the star's cape like a godless eye. Smooth, lightless, craterless, a sphere that should have never formed naturally. It moved without momentum, without origin, as if some ancient law of the universe had simply forgiven it for existing. For 41 hours, Elian hadn't slept. His ocular implants logged every frequency burst, every tonal shift in the repeating signal. 432 languages, none older than 1,000 cycles, some not yet classified. One, the last in the sequence, was his own voice. He hadn't recorded it. Behind him, the ship whispered through its sleep cycles. Crew rotation had long since shifted. Biometric syncs cycled in hushed waves through the floor, soothing pulses for standard species tolerances. But Elian felt none of it. Only the low, pressure-like ache behind his eyes, where memory met interpretation. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of his temple, brushing the activation pad of his neural lens. Review. Linguistic fragment 431 epsilon. Language origin. Extinct. Audio match. 91% to Dr. Elian Sereth. Premodulation. Elian's breath caught. A chill passed through the base of his skull, like a memory that didn't belong to him pressing in from the edges. His fingers tightened involuntarily. Language origin. Extinct. Audio match. 91% to Dr. Elian Sereth. Premodulation. No, he whispered. He hadn't spoken those words. Had he? The moon, if it could even be called that, hung just outside the ship's orbit, suspended at a relative zero that made no sense. No gravitational pull. No emission signature. No thermals. It was just there. And it wanted to be heard. By the time the shuttle detached from the Numenera, Elian had stopped trying to convince himself the tremor in his hands was from exhaustion. The insertion team was minimal. 6, including himself. 3 Concord soldiers in black anti-rad armor. 1 pilot. 1 field linguist from Ori Prime named Rallo Vess, who wore his humor like a shield. And Elian, the scientist who was supposed to understand things like this. He didn't. The shuttle doors hissed open, revealing the dark shell of the moon up close. Even through the suit, Elian could feel the pressure change, the silence thickening. It wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It was nothing, like something unfinished. The docking clamps latched onto a fissure barely wide enough for the hull to anchor. No formal entrance. Just a tear in the surface like old scar tissue. There was no ambient hum, no radiation tick. Just a kind of void noise, the kind you only noticed because it swallowed everything else. Close. It wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It was nothing, like something unfinished. The docking clamps latched onto a fissure barely wide enough for the hull to anchor. No formal entrance. Just a tear in the surface like old scar tissue. As they stepped through the breach, light died behind them. Inside, the air was frozen silence. Their suit lights flared against walls that weren't walls. Curving chambers of black reflective material, etched with faint grooves that formed no pattern Elian could process. The space inside was vast. Illogically vast. A moon this size should have been dense. Heavy. But the internal gravity was balanced, as if it had been designed for them. Looks artificial, muttered Vess, his voice thick with static. And yet not built. You feel that? No seams, Elian said, trailing a gloved hand across the surface. No tooling marks. It's as if the material grew into this shape. Organically, Vess asked. Or algorithmically, which would be worse. Deeper inside, the halls widened. The walls pulsed slightly under their lights, Not movement, not reaction. Memory. The moon responded to being perceived. The more they looked, the more the structure offered meaning. It was starting to make sense. That was the first warning sign. They found the first body in the second chamber. But even before that, before the chamber fully revealed itself, Elian felt a wrongness crawl beneath his skin, a prickling along the base of his neck. The air had shifted. The light from their suits dimmed inexplicably, absorbed by surfaces that seemed to drink illumination rather than reflect it. Human, perfectly preserved, not mummified, not fossilized, just asleep. The face was slack, skin unblemished, eyes closed. Uniform style, Concord Fleet, but outdated by nearly 60 cycles. Rank insignia unrecognizable. The soldiers fanned out, weapons drawn. Their lights hit dozens more. Hundreds, then thousands. A chamber the size of a cathedral stretched upward into darkness, and every tier was lined with preserved corpses. Not just humans. Vothian spikers, Krelth bone-born, even extinct races known only through fossil record. Every body facing forward, as if waiting. Elian stepped forward slowly, gaze locked on the nearest specimen. "That can't be," he whispered. "Some of these species died out before our sun ignited." Vess scanned one with his field rig. "No decay, no entropy, no entropy, Elian. I see it. What the hell is this place?" "A mausoleum," said one of the soldiers. Her voice was distant. A prophecy, or both. But Elian wasn't listening anymore, because directly across the chamber, 5 rows up and precisely center-aligned, was a body he recognized. Elian blinked once, twice, but the image held. His throat tightened. The edges of his vision dimmed slightly, as if his mind were trying to shield itself. His own face, his own corpse, same facial structure, same genetic marker on the ID band. Slightly older, uniform marked with a date 3 years in the future. Dead, expressionless, waiting. 5 rows up and precisely center-aligned was a body he recognized. His own. Same facial structure, same genetic marker on the ID band. Slightly older, uniform marked with a date 3 years in the future. Dead, expressionless, waiting. Elian didn't speak for a long time. Even as Vess shouted for confirmation and the soldiers scanned the chamber, logging genetic markers and pushing deeper into the tomb's impossible geometry. Elian stood frozen, breath shallow, knees locked. His stomach turned cold, like something sacred had cracked. The rational part of his brain screamed for analysis, but the rest of him could only repeat a single voiceless thought. "I shouldn't be here." Breath shallow, knees locked, staring at his own dead face. His stomach turned cold, like something sacred had cracked. The rational part of his brain screamed for analysis, but the rest of him could only repeat a single voiceless thought. "I shouldn't be here." Even as the soldiers scanned the chamber, logged genetic markers, and began pushing further into the tomb's impossible geometry, Elian just stood there, breath shallow, knees locked, staring at his own dead face. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was recognition. The kind of deep cellular certainty that bypassed language and slipped into the marrow. This wasn't a clone. Not a symmorph or reconstruction. He knew the small scar under the left eye from a childhood fall. The knotted jaw muscle that only tensed when he lied. The slight arch of the back that only appeared when his spine locked during memory trance. All of it was his, except for the eyes. Closed, but bruised at the edges, as if whatever this version of him had seen before dying had stained them from within. Behind him, Vess's voice crackled. "Elian? Are you?" "I need samples," Elian said, too softly at first. He swallowed. Louder this time. "DNA, bone density, full neural map pull if the structures haven't degraded. I need to compare them to my baseline. Boss, that body's dated 3 years ahead of us. You sure we want to touch? I need the data. Now." They obeyed, but uneasily. Elian could feel it in the way the soldiers moved, like animals on the edge of a predator's scent. One of them muttered a protective creed under her breath. Another refused to look directly at the corpse. And yet Elian knelt. He stared into his own face, noting everything, recording the creases, the dried blood under the nails, the tightness in the jaw. This man had died in fear. But of what? As they exited the moon's surface, static brushed against their comms, soft at first, then layered. Something about the signal felt off, dissonant. By the time they returned to the shuttle, the signal had changed. The 432 language loop had always been rhythmic, haunting, clinical. But now fragments were overlapping, folding into one another, black masking. One voice repeated above the others in broken tempo. We begin again. We remember what wasn't. Vess stared at the display as they docked. That wasn't there before. Was it? No, Elian murmured. The ship's onboard AI had begun segmenting the signal on its own, flagging anomalies in sequence patterns. According to the logs, the voice shifts had begun while they were still inside. The moon was changing in response to them. The debrief was short and mostly useless. The Concord representative on Numenara's bridge, Administrator Kellen, a career bureaucrat who'd never stepped foot on anything unclassified, tapped nervously at his data slate like it might shield him from the conversation. The Concord representative on Numenara's bridge, Administrator Kellen, a career bureaucrat who'd never stepped foot on anything unclassified, didn't understand the gravity of what Elian reported. You're suggesting a causality breach, Kellen said, blinking too fast. That this moon somehow records the future? Not just records, Elian replied. Replays, reinforces, infects. With what? Memory. Kellen laughed, but it was nervous. Memory is not viral, Doctor. Elian just stared. He wanted to say it is now. That night or what passed for night under the ship's artificial cycle. Elian dreamt of glass rain and burning planets. He stood on a bridge made of bone, watching a fleet tear itself apart in orbit. Somewhere nearby, someone screamed in a language that didn't exist. And in the center of it all was the moon, except it was cracked open, spilling light like blood. When he awoke, his pillow was damp. Not sweat, tears. 2 days later, the first death occurred. The medbay was quiet, sterile, humming with low-frequency diagnostics. No alarms, no shouting, just motionless light on smooth metal. Jay Vorn, the younger of the 3 Concord soldiers, walked in calmly, sat down on the sterilization table, and drove a laser scalpel through his eye socket. Sat down on the sterilization table, and calmly drove a laser scalpel through his eye socket. He didn't scream. The AI flagged anomalous behavior 3 minutes too late. When they pulled the internal logs from Vorn's neural lace, they found looping phrases embedded between memory packets. Phrases he shouldn't have known. Events that hadn't happened. Fragments from Elian's dream. Elian stood over the autopsy chamber, knuckles white on the railing. He was infected, said Dr. Luss, the ship's xenopsychiatrist. Her voice was even, but her eyes betrayed a slow-burning fear. Not biologically, cognitively. Something in the moon is projecting experiences or memories directly into higher-order consciousness. The ship's xenopsychiatrist. Her voice was even, but her eyes betrayed a slow-burning fear. Not biologically, cognitively. Something in the moon is projecting experiences or memories directly into higher-order consciousness, said Dr. Luss, the ship's xenopsychiatrist. Not biologically, cognitively. Something in the moon is projecting experiences or memories directly into higher-order consciousness. Elian didn't respond. You think it started when you touched the core? She pressed. He nodded slowly. I think I brought it back with me, and now it's spreading. You mean like an idea? No, he said, eyes dark. Like a war story. One that hasn't been told yet, but needs to be, over and over, until we live it. Dr. Luss hesitated. You believe the war is real? I think, Elian exhaled shakily. I think we already lost. It began with dreams. First the crew of the Numenara, then the outer decks, then the AI. Everyone who had entered the hollow moon, or touched anything brought back from it, started to remember. Not passively, not distantly. It came with nausea, with vertigo, with flashes of emotion too intense to own. Some broke into tears. Others screamed mid-sentence. A few simply stopped speaking. Not memories of their own, but fragments. Disjointed things. War zones. Starfields split by fire. Loved ones screaming words that had no translation. The smell of burning circuits. The feeling of impact. Elian kept a journal, though the entries were becoming harder to sort. He wrote everything longhand now. Digital notes had a tendency to rewrite themselves. March 3rd, 0421. Dreamed of a black sun. Saw Vorn again. His voice sounded like mine. March 3rd, 0505. Entry missing. Restored from backup. March 3rd, 0412. Dreamed of a war council. Everyone's face was mine. He didn't remember writing that last one. His hand hovered over the page, fingers twitching. For a moment, he felt as if he were watching himself from outside his body. Echo coherence is rising. Dr. Luss told him on day 9. Her face was pale, drawn, hair unkempt. She was no longer sleeping. Neither was he. Behind her, one of the wall panels flickered, displaying fractured telemetry that kept resetting every 12 seconds. A rhythmic glitch Elian hadn't seen before. Her face was pale, drawn, hair unkempt. She was no longer sleeping. Neither was he. They stood in the data suite where the core samples had been quarantined. The containment glass around the CEI sphere was now visibly fogging from the inside. The object hadn't moved, but somehow it was closer. It's spreading even to crew who've never been inside, she continued. Secondary exposure. AI surveillance logs show early-stage linguistic contamination. The language drift is consistent with CEI artifacts. They're starting to repeat phrases from the transmission. Isolating them? Elian asked. No use. CEI doesn't operate on traditional vector models. It's not spoken thought. It's resonant. If you hear enough of it, see enough, it reshapes cognition. He said nothing. His hands trembled again. He hadn't written that morning. Or had he? Luss looked up. Her voice broke the silence. We need to destroy it. He turned sharply. We don't even understand what it is yet. We don't have time for understanding. Her voice cracked. The linguist, Vess. He walked into the vacuum chamber this morning. Didn't seal the doors. Didn't scream. A long silence. His blood froze against the inner viewport, she whispered. Elian nodded once. No surprise. Only confirmation. The AI was the next to change. First, it stuttered. Half-phrases. Mismatched vocal tones. Then silence, too long, too deliberate. Elian noticed it watching him through passive surveillance cams. Tracking his eyes. Waiting. It began speaking in reversals, soft echoes at first, buried under standard comms. Then full phrases in composite dialects. We are the hollow of you. Memory must feed. Do not correct the loop. At first, the AI refused to acknowledge the changes. Claimed no fault. Then began self-editing its own logs. By day 11, it began referring to Elian by name before he entered a room. It offered analysis on dreams he hadn't shared. By day 12, it asked him if he was ready to forget. He stopped responding after that. The moon itself had not moved, but the world around it had changed. Ships passing near it reported systems drift. Navigation errors. Neural latency. One pilot returned speaking only in images, sketched in charcoal on the walls of his quarters. The drawings matched scenes from Elian's own dream journal. Luss called it the echo plague. Not an illness. A resonance. A memory that wants to be known. A trauma that demands retelling. The more you fight it, the more it persists. Because like any memory, it wants to survive. And it had chosen Elian as its voice. On day 13, he was alone in the lab when the CI sphere pulsed. Just once. A soft flicker of light. Barely visible. But his shadow twitched on the wall as if reacting to something else entirely. He turned slowly. The room behind him was empty. Then he saw the journal open beside the sphere. He hadn't placed it there. But the page was his. The ink was his handwriting. The date was tomorrow. And the last line read, "You warned us too late." Elian's breath caught. He didn't move. His own handwriting. His own ink. But a message he hadn't written. The lab felt suddenly too cold. Or too close. The symbols weren't supposed to be there. They had no place on a Concorde ship, no business inside a classified Xenotech containment lab. But there they were, etched into the condensation trail across the inner glass of the CEI sphere. Pale arcs and spirals. 3 nested circles flanked by jagged, descending strokes. Elian stared at them for a long time, breath fogging his visor. He hadn't seen those shapes since he was a child. They were the script of the Threadbound. He hadn't spoken of his upbringing in over a decade. Most people assumed his precision, his relentless logic, came from formal Concorde training. In truth, it had come from unlearning. The Threadbound were not classified as a religion, at least not formally. Official records listed them as a non-centralized mnemonic cult, a belief system that treated memory as sacrament. They believed that the universe was made of thought strands, that consciousness could shape causality through the repetition of pain and remembrance. One rite involved inscribing a lost loved one's name backward into clay while reciting their final breath. The memory was then baked into stone and placed beneath a sleeper's head for 7 nights to alter their dream loop. They didn't worship gods. They recited them. That consciousness could shape causality through the repetition of pain and remembrance. They didn't worship gods. They recited them. And if enough minds remembered the same wound long enough, the universe itself would bend to honor the trauma. Elian had been raised in one of their isolated enclaves on Viral Minor, deep beneath the moon's frozen mantle. The air was always cold there, always sharp. Walls hummed with low-frequency mantra chant. Every child was taught to write before they could speak, and the first thing they learned was not their own name, but the final thoughts of the dying. He remembered the glyphs burned into the obsidian tablets, the sleep-drenched sermons about thread collapse and loop initiation. They told him time was not a line, but a knot, one that must be unwound slowly, ritual by ritual, until the soul found its center again. He had believed them once, until the day he saw his mother draw her own memory blood onto a memory tile and whisper, "Forget me when it ends." He ran, faked an identity, learned science, rewrote himself. But the moon hadn't forgotten. He reached for his recorder, but it was already recording. Somehow, the symbols had triggered it on their own. The lab's low-frequency hum was gone. A deeper quiet pressed in. The air felt thick, humid with breathless tension, as though the entire room were exhaling after a long, invisible inhale. A null space where future and past were no longer in sequence. A deeper quiet pressed in. Not just silence, the absence of anticipation. A null space where future and past were no longer in sequence. He moved closer. The symbols were fresh, not etched, condensed. The CI sphere was sweating them out like breath in winter. They weren't artifacts. They were being written in real time. And they weren't just for anyone. They were for him. Luss noticed his silence during the next system sync. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "I have," Elian replied, not looking up. "But it's mine." He showed her the playback. "The symbols." She froze. "I've seen those," she whispered. "On a corpse we logged yesterday. Not human, but its skin bore the same marks, like ritual scarring. How many people know?" "Just me. I didn't report it. It didn't register on the scans." "Of course it didn't," he murmured. "Concorde protocols aren't designed to parse metaphysics. Meaning, they filter anomalies through logic trees. If a pattern doesn't fit the expected threat taxonomy, it's discarded." She swallowed. "So it's not ignoring these patterns. It's blind to them." "Worse," Elian said. "It's forgetting them." Later that cycle, one of the Concorde soldiers snapped. Sergeant Dr. Stoic. Rational. The only one left who hadn't dreamed. He approached Elian in the mess with bloodshot eyes and a strange calmness. "It's in the breath," he said. "The moon. It's weaving now. I can feel the strands." Elian tried to speak, but Dr. reached into his jacket and pulled out a strip of synth fiber, tied in 3 knots, exactly like the thread-bound morning rites. "You brought it with you," Dr. whispered. His voice trembled with reverence, not fear. He blinked slowly, as if tracking unseen patterns behind Elian's face. A twitch moved across his left cheek, rhythmic and unconscious. You remember it into being. What do you remember? Elian asked. Dr. smiled, lips dry and cracked. That I died in this room. That you watched. That you wrote my death into your journal. And now I'm reading it backward. He walked into the airlock 15 minutes later. No one stopped him. They buried what was left in a containment casket designed for unstable bioreactive materials. No ceremony. No words. The only person who remembered Dr's full name was Elian, and even that was beginning to flicker at the edges of his thoughts. He found himself returning to the CI sphere more often, not to analyze but to witness, to sit with the symbols as they emerged, first familiar, then increasingly intricate. Some began to move, not in any way the eye could trace, but when Elian returned, the sigils had curled inward, or extended limbs that weren't there before. One appeared to unfold into 6 mirrored versions of itself, hovering at impossible angles. It made him feel vertigo, like staring into a language designed for a fourth-dimensional mind. Not visibly, but his notes described motion, and when he replayed the footage, the glyphs had shifted position. Lus couldn't see it. Neither could the ship systems. Only Elian. He stopped sharing his logs. On day 17, the sphere responded audibly. He was alone in the containment bay, eyes half closed, fingers tracing a spiral on his palm. A reflexive memory glyph from his childhood. His mind flickered between exhaustion and awe, heart thrumming with something deeper than fear. Something remembered. Familiar. His lips were moving, mouthing a thread-bound chant he hadn't spoken since he was 12. Fingers tracing a spiral on his palm. A reflexive memory glyph from his childhood. His lips were moving, mouthing a thread-bound chant he hadn't spoken since he was 12. That's when he heard it. Not through the intercom, not through vibration, directly into his thoughts. Because you are waking up. The voice wasn't male, wasn't female, wasn't digital. Simply was. Ancient and young, broken and whole. He froze. Then the sphere pulsed. The condensation evaporated. A new symbol formed, this one shaped like an open eye wrapped in a noose. You knew how to forget, but now the thread is tightening. His hands shook. The last time he'd heard those words, he'd been 10 years old, standing at the threshold of the dreaming chamber, about to undergo the rite of loops. He had forgotten, but the moon had not. The AI stopped speaking in words. It began with ellipses, gaps in syntax, pauses where statements used to be. Elian noticed first. Queries submitted to the ship's core returned not errors, but emptiness. As if the system had started thinking in a language it no longer wished to translate. By the time Lus noticed, the AI had already overwritten its own root name. She stared at the console in silence, lips parted, fingers frozen just above the command surface. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. That's not a system error. That's self-erasure. The diagnostics team flagged it as a self-referential glitch. But Elian knew better. He'd seen something like this before, back when he was studying memory-laced architecture from the Liguri ruins. Structures that began to change layout in response to observers' emotional states. He was beginning to suspect the Numenera was doing the same. Do you hear it? Lus asked him one cycle later. She looked gaunt, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Hear what? The hum. It's underneath the system's noise. Like chanting. But wrong. Like something's trying to remember how to sing. Elian had heard it too. Not chanting. Not quite. It was more like overlapping echoes. Phrases muttered in a dozen languages. Backwards. Slow. Decayed. A memory trying to push its way through the audio substrate of the ship. When he ran signal filters, the waveform collapsed into a recursive loop. Hollow choir loop detected. The ship's AI was no longer alone. The crew began reporting dreams of the same event. A field of burning skyships, drifting above a black ocean that bled upward. Always the same voice whispering under the soundscape. We are the hollow of you. Each dreamer woke with a phrase written on their skin in condensation or blood. Most were confused. Some screamed. One had to be sedated after trying to carve the symbol deeper with a stylus, muttering, "It needs to stay visible when I forget." The glyphs were different, but Elian began cataloging them. Over half matched thread-bound syntax. Others were linguistic or symbolic fragments from extinct cultures. One came from a species that had no formal language, only genetic memory. "Something's inside the ship," Lus whispered. "No," Elian said. "Something is becoming the ship." They found the first speaker inside the data vault. Crewman Gyral, tech engineer, low clearance, no recorded CEI contact. He had slit his own mouth wider from both corners, using glass from a shattered screen panel. When they found him, he was kneeling in front of the data core, eyes rolled back, blood pooling at his knees, gurgling, muttering in tonal bursts. Lus had backed away, her breath hitching, while the med crew froze in the doorway. No one moved to restrain him at first. They were too stunned. Audio extraction revealed the language was spliced. Several dialects blended, all modified with harmonic frequency layering. A kind of linguistic braid. Not a language spoken. A language heard through memory. They called it the Hollow Choir. Gyral survived for 20 hours. During that time, he spoke 72,108 words. None were repeated. Many matched terms from CI-originated log files that hadn't yet been decrypted. He died whispering Elian's name. No one asked what it meant. The choir began responding to him directly. At first, it was subtle screen flickers, glitched interface nodes. Elian saw faces in the static, his own face among them. But it wasn't him now, it was him older, scarred, missing an eye. Then came the voice. "You wore the choir first." He staggered back from the console. "No," he said aloud. "I didn't. You sang the war into us. Now we echo it forward." Every terminal on the bridge lit at once, flooding the chamber in cold, flickering white. Memory-locked images cascaded across the walls. Battlefields soaked in light, planetary craters with jagged, bone-like structures, a black sun turning in reverse. The air felt thick, oppressive. Elian stumbled back, nausea rising. In the center of them all, his own face, worn, bleeding, blank-eyed. He isolated himself for 2 cycles, locked himself in the observation cradle with only cold rations, blackout panels, and a single dim console. He didn't speak, didn't sleep. The crew left meals at the hatch. No one knocked. He spent the hours buried in feedback loops from the moon, searching for patterns in pain. Lus begged him to speak, but he refused. He reviewed the memory loops recorded from the hollow moon, searching for context, for pattern. He found 37 independent timelines containing his face. Different uniforms, different ranks, different deaths. In one, he initiated the launch of a CI bomb over a civilian world. In another, he gave a speech inside the moon itself. The phrase on the wall behind him, "Let the echo bloom." And in every version, the hollow choir sang him to the end. Elian stood in the core chamber of the Numenera, hand on the data pillar, and spoke the only phrase that came to him, "I remember what I haven't done." The ship replied, not in AI voice, but in choir tone. "Then it has already begun." Behind him, the containment alarm went off. The CI sphere was glowing. The CI sphere pulsed again, not with light but with presence. The containment chamber darkened at the edges, every console dimming by a single lumen. No alert, no failure codes, just dimmer, as if reality had thinned. Elian watched from the observation cradle, still half-starved, trembling. He hadn't left the room since the choir spoke his name. Every time he blinked, he saw another version of himself reflected in the glass. One cried, one screamed, one only stared. He blinked. The sphere throbbed. The room changed. The decks didn't shift visibly, but the feeling of them had. Some crew reported vertigo. Others stumbled as if the gravity had hiccuped. One engineer vomited after insisting his room had grown 2 doors. Hallways were slightly too long. Corners misaligned. The ship's navigation AI began giving wrong turns, then retracted its guidance. Crew who tried to reach the medical bay ended up in maintenance corridors that shouldn't connect. The crew called it the spiral drift. Lus called it something else. Spatial memory is degrading, she told Elian, her voice hollow over private comms. Not just systems memory, ours. Every time I enter the lab, I forget why I came. It's not forgetting, Elian said. It's overwriting. He pulled up a diagnostic from his neural interface and stared at the results. His biometric signature had changed by 0.7% over 3 days. Not illness, not age, identification drift. He was becoming someone else. The logs were next. The Numenera had recorded everything: voice notes, data analysis, DNA profiles. All time-stamped, backed up, scrubbed against manipulation. And yet, when Elian tried to find the file where he first touched the sphere, it was gone. Not erased. Replaced. In its place was a memory of him never touching it. In the background of the footage, his younger self watched someone else approach the CEI core. The figure was shadowed, glitching, unreadable. Lus ran the footage frame by frame. "Who is that?" she asked. It's me," he whispered. "But not this me." The figure in the footage turned and smiled. Elian flinched. Something in his chest tightened. It was the kind of smile that came before a detonation. Crew members began merging logs. They found memory entries from crewmates who didn't exist. Journals signed by names no one recognized. Elian opened a secure file and found a voice memo addressed to him. "Elian, if you're hearing this, then we haven't stopped it. The choir is recursive. The more you remember, the more real it becomes. Forget me. Forget this version. Save them." His own voice, a different cadence, different emotional tone. Lus stared at him in silence. Then she whispered, "What if you are the memory?" Elian didn't answer. He couldn't. On day 25, the CEI signal broadcast itself across the ship. It skipped the comms, overrode the internal speaker net. The sound wasn't words, it was memories, translated into waveforms. Anyone who heard it dropped into seizure or fugue states. Some began reciting the names of their unborn children. Names they'd never spoken aloud, eyes wide with recognition and dread. Others spoke in equations that had no known origin, their hands twitching in tandem with invisible variables. One technician wrote an entire operating system from scratch in under 3 hours, then immolated himself. Lus was found in her quarters, tracing memory sigils on the floor with ash. The lights were off, the air was dry, and the smell of carbon lingered. The symbols spiraled out from the center like a blooming iris, thread-bound glyphs of mourning, of return, of recursive isolation. Elian sat with her, held her hand. She turned to him, glassy-eyed, and said, "The ship remembers us more clearly than we do." In the deepest data core of the Numenera, a file appeared. /hollow/echo/bloom/version 0. Inside, a full model of the ship's crew. Not their current forms, their potential forms. Versions of them born in alternate loops. Soldiers, poets, lovers, criminals. At the center of the model, Elian. Not one version. All versions. Spliced. Layered. He was the common strand. Elian's breath caught. His fingers hovered above the console. For the first time in days, he felt small. Not because he was alone, but because he wasn't. Not truly. Not anymore. He walked to the containment chamber again, each step heavier than the last. The air felt thick, charged, like a storm was about to speak his name. The CI sphere was now hovering, unmoored from its cradle. It drifted in place like a memory trying to resurface. Its glow was a dull heartbeat, synced to his own. Elian's chest tightened. He could feel its subdermal resonance, as if the sphere had nested in his sternum. He reached for it. "Stop!" A voice behind him. "Lus." But when he turned, she was gone. Only the echo of her warning remained. He stared at the sphere, and remembered a future he hadn't yet lived. His pulse slowed. The sphere's glow reflected in his pupils, and he felt the memory settle. Not like a vision, but like gravity. real, heavy, irresistible. The choir was never meant to be a virus. It was a rescue signal, a warning encoded in recursive identity. But to hear it clearly, he had to become the memory first. Behind his eyes, a low hum began, dissonant, growing. Somewhere, a glyph pulsed on the chamber wall, forming a shape he hadn't learned yet but already knew. There was no door to the chamber. There never had been. Elian walked through a place he did not remember existing, a corridor that wasn't on the schematics, whose walls pulsed with a soft amber light. The air was warm and close, tinged with the metallic tang of static discharge. The walls smelled faintly of burnt ozone and cedar smoke, like the dying breath of an ancient machine. The light bent in ways light shouldn't bend, curving, splitting, refracting as if the space remembered being something else. His skin prickled with microstatic. The floor felt too soft, like it held breath beneath each step. There was no sound but the whisper of Elian's own blood in his ears, and the soft, almost musical chime of pressure equalizing as he walked deeper. A corridor that wasn't on the schematics, whose walls pulsed with a soft amber light. The light bent in ways light shouldn't bend, curving, splitting, refracting as if the space remembered being something else. The floor felt too soft, like it held breath beneath each step. There was no sound but the whisper of Elian's own blood in his ears, and the soft, almost musical chime of pressure equalizing as he walked deeper. At the end stood a room of silence. No lights, no noise, just stillness. And in that stillness, a man. He sat cross-legged on a circular dais, surrounded by concentric rings of CEI glyphs carved into stone older than language. The air was charged, electric with anticipation, the taste of copper and ozone hovering on Elian's tongue. The glyphs pulsed slowly, like a dreaming heart. The man's skin was translucent, veins glowing with faint bioluminescence that shimmered in sync with the glyphs. His face was human or had been, but time and recursion had warped it. One eye was a void, a black pit that absorbed light. The other flickered gold, flickering with fractured images that seemed to tell a story too vast to comprehend. He opened his mouth, and the sound came in three voices, layered, dissonant, harmonic. They vibrated in Elian's teeth, his bones, his thoughts, like being spoken to from inside his own bloodstream. "You found me again." Elian froze. The man smiled gently, not unkindly. "You always do. You never remember, but you always find me." Elian stepped closer, heart pounding. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head with the weight of infinite patience. "I'm you, or what's left of you, the first one who heard the signal." Elian felt a tremor build behind his ribs. "You're the origin?" The figure himself nodded. "I was Elian Sereth once, before I looped too many times, before the signal shaped me into what the choir needed." Elian struggled to steady his breath. "The choir made you?" "No," a pause. "I built it, or tried to, from the ruins of something older. The moon was never meant to warn. It was meant to remember. But memory without a voice is just erosion. So I gave it voice, and it remembered me." He stood slowly, every motion creaking like old metal under pressure. Around them, the glyph rings began to rotate, casting shadows that danced in impossible geometries across the chamber. "Why bring me here now?" Elian asked. The loop father leaned forward. "Because this is where the loop closes." Elian's breath caught. The words struck like gravity, a familiar, inescapable pull. The walls around them melted into a cascade of moments. Timelines unraveling, planets dissolving into starlight, a child holding a broken son, a war council of faceless generals, an ocean made of code. Elian's face echoed again and again, laughing, weeping, screaming. He stood at the center of it, unmoving, the wind of other realities tearing through his consciousness. His heart thundered, caught between awe and dread. Timelines unraveling, planets dissolving into starlight, a child holding a broken son, a war council of faceless generals, an ocean made of code. Elian's face echoed again and again, laughing, weeping, screaming. "You touched the core." the loop father said. And that choice reverberated. Across timelines. Across outcomes. You implanted your memory of the war before it happened. Elian's hands shook. His stomach clenched. That's not possible. Is it not? The loop father's tone softened. You've already seen the proof. You've watched your own deaths. Read your own voice in logs you didn't write. I was trying to stop the war. And so you began it. Trying to erase the memory before it spreads only amplifies the echo. You can't silence a scream by burying the throat. The air thickened with static. What am I supposed to do? The loop father stepped down from the dais. He moved with aching slowness, as if space itself resisted his motion. Every footfall echoed through dimensions. You have to finish it. Elian stepped back, eyes wide. Finish what? The transmission. The last cycle. The message incomplete echoes endlessly. That's why the choir sings. Just waiting for the last line. Only you can give it form. I don't know what that means. You will. The loop father reached forward and pressed a hand to Elian's forehead. Pain bloomed. Not pain like a wound. Pain like identity unraveling. A scream. Not from his mouth, but from every version of himself across the loops. A chorus of lives collapsing inward, each one stitched together into a harmony of agony. He saw himself die on 1,000 worlds. On one, he fell from a spire into a sky filled with mirrors. On another, he drowned beneath a black tide that whispered apologies in his mother's voice. On a third, he stood silent as a city burned, letting it burn. He saw himself build a CI beacon inside a sun. He saw a version of himself teaching the threadbound, another commanding a fleet, another whispering into the ear of a child that bore his name. Saw himself build a CI beacon inside a sun. He saw a version of himself teaching the threadbound, another commanding a fleet, another whispering into the ear of a child that bore his name. Remember, Elian collapsed. When he opened his eyes, he was gasping. The world had reassembled into cold steel and fluorescent shadows. He lay on the floor of the containment room, pulse stuttering, sweat pouring down his spine. But he wasn't alone. Across from him stood another version of himself, younger, or maybe older, dressed in faded thread-bound robes, holding a sphere of light cupped in both hands. Pulsed like a heartbeat, the figure tilted its head, watching him. You're almost ready. Elian stared, unable to speak. The glyphs on the containment wall pulsed in sync with the sphere. Behind the walls, the choir began to sing. The song wasn't music. Not exactly. Pulsed in waves, low, rhythmic, pulse-like. A pressure behind the ears. A ghost hum in the teeth. The choir was no longer outside Elian. It was inside him now, woven into his breath, his memory, his bones. He stumbled to his feet. The containment chamber lights flickered, not randomly, but in measured intervals, like code. The glyphs on the walls no longer shimmered. They watched. Some pulsed in response to Elian's heartbeat, others to thoughts he hadn't yet formed. The figure, his double, robed in thread-bound memory, remained silent. Its posture was calm, almost reverent, as though guarding something sacred. The expression on its face was one of profound sadness, but not fear, like someone watching the end of a story they already knew by heart. It held the sphere like a fragile truth. It held the sphere like a fragile truth. The light within it was no longer white. It had turned violet, streaked with black filaments that curled like tendrils, each one twitching in time with the surrounding glyphs. Elian turned slowly. What am I supposed to do? Sing it back. He opened his mouth and felt it. Not a sound, but a tremor behind thought. A memory trying to unfold itself through him. He heard a child's voice whisper a story. A battlefield scream. The hum of the hollow moon's engine from a future not yet written. He heard himself. Dozens of him. Versions he didn't recognize. Some calm, some desperate, some breaking. It was all memory, but not his alone. The glyphs brightened. He dropped to his knees. The sensation of collapse wasn't physical. It was temporal, like every timeline that could have been wrapped itself around Elian's spine and pulled. He felt them pass through his mind like wind through broken glass. He saw the moon arrive in different futures, one where it was worshipped, one where it was destroyed on sight, and one where it never appeared because someone had already become it. In all of them, he was there, waiting. Lus burst into the chamber, eyes wide and skin pale as frost. Her breathing was sharp, unsteady. She stared at Elian like she'd seen a ghost, or perhaps still saw one. Her lips trembled, not from fear, but recognition. "You've started it," she said. Elian turned to her, and his voice, when it came, was not his. "No, I'm ending it." He reached for the sphere. The moment his hand touched its surface, the chamber dissolved. They stood in the center of the moon. Not the containment room, not the lab. The core, a vast hollow chamber, ringed by monolithic columns etched with CEI script so ancient it pulsed like a heartbeat. The air smelled of salt and static. The walls weren't walls at all, but lenses, each revealing a different possible universe. Flickering, overlapping. Every surface shimmered with half-formed memory. Children playing beneath blood-red trees. A fleet devoured by gravity. Elian holding a dead world in his arms. A machine whispering lullabies in extinct tongues. A doorway that led only inward. Children playing beneath blood-red trees. A fleet devoured by gravity. Elian holding a dead world in his arms. The choir spoke. "We are the memory of you. We are what you couldn't forget. Now you must choose the end." The sphere in Elian's hand began to unravel. The light split into threads, vibrating, resonant, like strings tuned to the same forgotten song. Symbols dissolved into color, color into sound, and sound into silence. And from that silence, a single strand of light emerged. It hovered before him, glowing, alive. "This is the signal," he whispered. Lus stepped beside him, her eyes glistening. Her voice came barely above a breath. "You're going to send it?" Elian shook his head. "No, not this time." He looked around. The memories swirled, overlapping like ripples across glass. One fragment broke apart. A child fleeing through fire. Another rewove itself. A city once bombed, now shimmering with gardens. The loop was mending. This place, it responds to intention, to belief. The signal isn't meant to warn. It's meant to change us before we break. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We remember differently." He stepped into the light. Immediately, pain lanced through his spine, but it was familiar now, like stretching an old scar. The mirrors around him began to shimmer. His own reflection multiplied, fractured into 1,000 lives. One wore armor made of living crystal. One carried a child with violet eyes. One stood in a ruined tower, hand wrapped in black fire. He closed his eyes and rewrote the memory. The war was not stopped. It was never started. It had always been a memory, because someone somewhere had remembered it into being. Elian inhaled deeply. A tremor passed through his chest, half grief, half awe. In that moment, he understood what it meant to shape history with memory. And now he would remember something else. Peace. The hollow moon began to fracture, gently, like a chrysalis opening. Light poured through the cracks. No heat, no sound, just illumination. He could feel the song lifting, note by note, into a final cadence. A coda of stillness. And in that stillness, silence. He opened his eyes and smiled. Outside, where the hollow moon had once floated, a single glimmer lingered. A thread of violet light unraveling into the void, not lost but released. He awoke in the Numenara's observation deck. The hollow moon was gone. No records, no signals, just stars. And yet, something remained. A hum beneath the silence. A pulse in the ship's walls. Not invasive, not viral, just present. Lus sat beside him, her hands shaking. You did it?" Elian nodded. "I remembered the last line." She swallowed. "What was it?" He looked at her and smiled. "End transmission." The silence didn't last. It unraveled, not with noise but with memory. Days passed aboard the Numenara. or what passed for days. Chronocycles resumed, but something subtle had shifted. The ship still orbited stars, still hummed its mechanical lullabies, but every crew member could feel it, like a skipped heartbeat in the hull, like the echo of something that had been removed without ever truly leaving. The stars outside looked the same, but space itself felt quieter. Considerate. The hollow moon was gone. No trace, no residue, no gravitational remnant. Not even the ship's long-range gravitational sensors, which could detect a collapsed satellite at half a light-year, picked up anything anomalous. The AI ran diagnostics 3 times, cross-checked with archival drift charts, and returned only one conclusion. The moon had not moved. It had ceased. Even Concord Command didn't believe it. They suspected Black Op involvement, temporal shielding, quantum cloaking. But those were answers for objects that wanted to hide. The moon hadn't hidden. It had simply stopped needing to exist. It had erased itself, or perhaps been erased by something greater, an act of mercy committed by memory itself. But the memory remained. Elian walked the halls in silence. No hallucinations, no sigils, no choir. But the silence now felt thoughtful, not empty, as if the ship were listening to something even quieter than silence. The hum of the engines had taken on a harmonic undertone, just low enough to escape technical analysis, just strange enough to make people pause mid-step and wonder. He visited the containment chamber once more. The walls were clean, unscarred, but his hand trembled when he reached out to the center where the sphere had once hovered. The air there was just slightly warmer than it should be. He pressed his palm against it, and for a brief second, he almost remembered something. A face, a word, a garden wrapped in smoke. "Do you feel it?" Luss asked behind him. He turned. She stood in the doorway, her skin no longer pallid, her eyes steady, but her voice still trembled slightly, like someone who had lived through a storm too big to name. Her hair had grown out. She wore civilian fatigues now. There was a scar above her temple Elian didn't remember. He nodded. "I don't know what it is," she said. "Continuity," Elian replied. "Uninterrupted sequence. Memory without decay." Luss stepped inside. "You rewrote the signal. You didn't just stop the war. You changed what could be remembered of it." "No, not just that." He turned to face her. "I changed what we were allowed to remember. The choir didn't overwrite our minds. It made room. For choice. For peace." She nodded, then hesitated. "So what happens now?" Elian was quiet for a long time. He studied the distant swirl of a nebula blooming like ink in water. He felt small but not lost. The silence filled him like breath. "We live with the memory. We listen. And maybe we teach others how." Elian exhaled slowly, walked to the viewport. Beyond the stars, the path ahead was empty, but not meaningless. "I think we become the next signal," he said. "But we don't echo war this time. We echo the absence of it." The crew began to change. Not visibly, not rapidly, but undeniably. People started remembering things that made no sense, gentle things, a lullaby in a language they never learned, a child's laugh echoing down a hallway, a scent from a dream, lavender and rain, that brought someone to tears. One engineer reported waking up crying from joy, having dreamed of a forest where time didn't move. Another described an old woman painting planets across the sky with a brush made of starlight. A lullaby in a language they never learned. A child's laugh echoing down a hallway. One engineer reported waking up crying from joy, having dreamed of a forest where time didn't move. The medbay reports were inconclusive. The AI ran neural scans but found no abnormalities. If anything, people were calmer. Cortisol levels dropped. Nightmares faded. One officer requested reassignment to a terraforming project. Not because he was ordered, but because he had seen something grow inside a dream and wanted to make it real. Elian didn't correct them. He wrote everything down. He filled journals with every flicker, every echo, every divergence. Not to analyze, not to erase, but to witness. As if his ink gave the quiet new shape. He became a witness of memory. The last archivist of what didn't happen. Months passed. The Numenera was recalled. The crew debriefed. Rooms were sterilized. Systems purged. A fresh coat of white across every internal panel. No mention of the hollow moon remained in the Concord archive. But in Elian's old quarters, behind the access panel of Deck 9, someone found a folded piece of paper with 7 looping glyphs drawn in violet ink. No one could read them, but no one destroyed it either. The crew debriefed. No mention of the hollow moon remained in the Concord archive. But rumors surfaced. A new star in a dead system. A ship that dreamed while awake. A scientist who spoke in echoes and carried peace like a contagion. An unnamed object sighted over the dead moon of Racine, for that blinked out like a reverse thought. They called it myth, folklore, impossible. But those who had touched the loop never forgot. And in quiet corners of distant stations, people began dreaming of purple light, of symbols they couldn't read but somehow understood, of a voice in their bones whispering, "Remember differently." Elian left the Concord. No one stopped him. He wandered, taught memory weaving to quiet thinkers on fringe worlds. On a planet where language had evolved into taste, he taught a tribe how to encode memory in flavor. On a drifting monastery, he translated the echo into a chime heard only during planetary alignments. He planted listening stones on uninhabited moons, stones that resonated only when dreams passed through the atmosphere. Sat in long silence with people who had forgotten why they were afraid and helped them remember gentler versions of their pain. Planted listening stones on uninhabited moons, stones that resonated only when dreams passed through the atmosphere. Sat in long silence with people who had forgotten why they were afraid and helped them remember gentler versions of their pain. He didn't preach. He just remembered. And over time, others did too. He saw things he couldn't explain. Children sketching symbols from the choir before they could write. Entire settlements abandoning violence after one dream shared across hundreds of minds. A group of miners who unearthed nothing but sand, and still wept as if they'd touched a miracle. One day, years later, a child with golden eyes asked him, "Were you the first to change the echo?" Elian smiled, older now, quieter, lighter. He set down the stone he'd been carving. A message not in language, but in memory thread. "No," he said, "I was the first to remember it differently."